All right, so let's finish up chapter 2. I'm going to go through the rest of the chapter relatively fast, knowing that you can stop and rewind as often as you need to. So, as we talk about perception, it's important to look at a lot of things. We've examined the process, the stages of perception. Now let's take a look at some of the critical influences. Okay, so looking at some of the influences on perception, there are several. One of the most predominant is culture, which is huge, absolutely huge. Culture, which we'll examine in the next chapter, so I don't want to get into it too much, influences a lot of your interpretation because it helps establish what your norms are. Just a simple example, years ago I was in India for a month, and as I was walking down the street, the girl that I was with, who I had become friends with, reached down to grab my hand so we could walk down the street hand in hand. And at first I looked at her funny, and I looked at our hands, and I had the typical American perception or stereotype of that, and I was very confused. And at that point I sort of looked around with fresh eyes and saw that it was very common and fairly normal to walk hand in hand, arm in arm, with people that were just friends in India, and I saw it all around me. So that's just one example of how culture can influence perception. Sex and gender, important to understand that's two different things. Sex has to do with biological factors. Certainly things influence the way men and women perceive life differently. Gender has a lot to do with norms, and the norms, cultural, what is a female, what is a male, what are they supposed to do, and culture influences that as well. Physical factors can include anything from how being fatigued, being very tired. If you've ever noticed that you're more irritable and things bother you when you're tired, that's what this is connected to. The notion that when you go grocery shopping on an empty stomach, you'll throw things in your shopping cart that you never would purchase. But because of your hunger, you are, tempted. Technology influences your perception because of the channel, the technology influences what you see and how you see things, and so that has an influence. And of course your own sense of self, particularly your self-esteem, influences how you receive things. Okay, so understanding yourself. Here we have a definition of self-concept that's discussed in the book. The most important part of this definition is the notion of relatively stable set of perceptions. That's because we all have moments of greatness when we just think, oh, that was just awesome, sort of God's gift to the world. And then we have moments of utter stupidity when we are just looking for a rock to climb under because we just did or something that made us feel like an utter fool. So we're talking the norm, the baseline. In general, how do you view yourself? That goes with the idea of self-concept. In other things to consider under this understanding yourself, there's a lot here. Symbolic actionism has to do with the fact that you create your self-esteem through your interaction with people via a process called social comparison and another process called reflected appraisal. It is through your interaction with people that you develop the concept of who you are as a person, whether that is an internal trait, whether that's an interaction trait, the idea whether you're smart or not so smart, whether you're funny, whether you're athletic. All of that is developed by the way that you have interacted with other people. Self-awareness is essentially your self-concept, how acutely aware you are of yourself and your interactions. Self-esteem is how you feel about your self-concept. They're two very different things and not very logically connected. Self-esteem is very subjective. Self-fulfilling prophecy, here we have the four components of self-fulfilling prophecy. The important thing to understand with self-fulfilling prophecy is it can be self-imposed and it can be imposed by others, sort of outside in. And again, you can go to the text for some more detail on that. Let's talk about identity management. Identity management is the idea of impression formation and trying to manage the impressions that you create. Typically, this is broken down into three different things that you tend to control. If you think about it, going on a date, what's one of the first things you do? You clean your car, you wash your car. You're trying to control the setting in a manner to influence the impressions that you create. Girls, you spend a lot of time on your appearance. If I can type right, because that helps it to build an impression that you want to build. And both of you spend a lot of time working on behavior. And whether it's opening the door, whether it's, you know, the polite way in which you speak to each other, all of that is in an effort to influence the impressions that you create. Another way to look at identity management is this discussion of face work, which has to do with the self that you present to other people. Positive self, negative self, the idea of self-monitoring, that whole awareness becomes very important in this section. Then we want to talk a little bit about how perception, self, how does this all work with communication? And specifically, we're going to look at implicit personality theory and attribution theory. And what in the world do these terms mean? Well, implicit personality theory is the idea that we tend to group things together. If I have this sentence, John is handsome, clever, and I ask you to fill in the blank, and you have two choices. Okay, your choice is either athletic or clumsy. And I would say, okay, well, which word do you want to insert in the blank? And the odds are most of you are going to choose athletic, because this is a positive trait and it matches the positive trait of handsome and clever. We call this a positive halo effect. And you know, if you start off on the right foot with somebody, then it's sort of the idea that you can do no wrong. You'll get a favorable impression of other behaviors because you've already been positive. The reverse also exists, and that's a negative halo. If you have ever gotten off on the wrong foot with somebody, and it seems like no matter what you do, you just can't seem to catch a break with this particular person, and they always seem to interpret the things that you do in a negative manner. That's a very true reality and is the negative halo effect. Attribution theory is interesting. This has to do with how we tend to interpret behavior of other people based on our relationship with them. For example, let's say we have John and Sarah, and let me make my font a little bit smaller. I have John and Sarah, and the situation that is at hand is Sarah is late for the meeting. Okay? Then the question is the interpretation. So if John and Sarah have a positive relationship, okay, they have a lot of mutual respect, they work together well, John thinks Sarah is great, Sarah thinks John is great, it's a very positive relationship. What occurred, okay, she is late to the meeting. John's perception of why Sarah is late might be Sarah ran into trouble. Maybe she ran into red lights. Maybe there was a lot of traffic on the road. Okay. Maybe the time was not communicated. Bottom line, it's not really her fault. On the other hand, if how do I want to do this? If you have this scenario, okay, where Sarah does not like John, John does not like Sarah, Sarah is late. So now the interpretation of Sarah's late behavior is that Sarah is rude. She is lazy. She is undisciplined. All internal qualities. Nothing external. If you notice all of these, red lights, traffic, time wasn't told to her, that's all external. But here with the negative, we attribute it to false, or rather to very negative internal motives. That's attribution theory. Okay, so now we get to the part of the chapter that deals with how to improve your perception so that they're more accurate, how to improve your self-concept. So first, in terms of checking your perceptions, the whole process of something called perception checking, I'm going to spend more time on separately. In fact, it's going to be a learning activity. So we'll skip that for now, and it's described in your textbook. Understanding your personal worldview, understanding your own biases is important. Realize that it's only a small fraction of the reality. The more you are open to information, the more likely your perceptions will become more accurate. Understand the difference between a fact and an inference. A fact might be somebody did not return a phone call. The inference would be your interpretation of the motivation of that lack of a phone call. And that the more patient, more tolerant you are, generally, the more likely you will be to get accurate perceptions. In terms of improving your self-concept, these are the discussions or the items mentioned in your book for ways to improve those, and definitely important. I like the last one. Previously I've called them ego boosters and ego busters, and if you are surrounded by people who continually bring you down, maybe with negative self-fulfilling prophecies, you might really want to consider, the whole bad company and good company and what it corrupts, and surround yourself with the most positive you can. That's it for now, so I'll join you again in a few minutes to discuss Chapter 3.